Okay, so this is John Chandler, and I'm here with my friend Jürg Gassman, who's coming in from Ireland, a little bit south of Dublin, from what I understand. Is that right? Yeah, Jürg?
Correct. Correct.
So Jürg is somebody who I've known basically through digital media for several years, and we've discussed many things over the years, and I've gotten to know his kids, his family, and so Jürg is someone from a learned background and had a pretty impressive education before we met, and has, like me, got into historical fencing and was drawn into the research side of the historical fencing world. So Jürg has been kind of a collaborator for me in figuring out a lot of things, and he's taught me several things that are pretty key to understanding the medieval world. So I'd like to introduce Jürg now, and Jürg could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hello. Well, I have a pretty diverse background, and we could fill the half hour just discussing that. But just where we enter historical time, that is when I started to get involved with historical fencing, was when we moved to Switzerland in 2007. The kids were still quite young at the time. Jack was 12, Sam was 9. So 2007. So we previously lived in basically the family were mostly in Great Bend, Kansas, and I was traveling back and forth for work. But by 2007, we were ready to buy a house in Switzerland. And in Kansas, my wife Pamela had taken the kids to SCA, Society for Creative Anachronism, and so when we moved to Switzerland, we wanted to. And I mean, they were too young to really participate, but they thought it was great fun. And we were also participating in several events that had been organized by one of the guys from the Kansas City Renaissance Fair, which was also great fun. And so when we moved to Switzerland, we wanted to continue with fencing at some level. And we didn't know about HEMA yet, but I took the kids to Olympic fencing. That was a bust. The trainer there was so incredibly nasty. I was astounded by how nasty she was. And so even though we told the kids, no, we take this seriously, we're not going to just walk away when it gets tough. I said, no, I'm not. We're not forcing this on you. So we walked away from that. And so then the next, Jack then came up with a suggestion that we should go to a LARP event. And that's where I put the foot down. This was some camping for a week out in the sticks in Germany somewhere. I said, look, guys, the point about these LARP events is you get together, you sit around the campfire and you drink, and you're too young to drink. These guys are literally young enough to be my kids. So this is not going to work. I'm not doing it. And then Pamela came up. She found an event, a HEMA event. This was the Arts of Mars in near Hanover in Germany.
And, okay, Collins thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Collins event. And so we went there and we had a blast. And that was sort of the beginning of our HEMA journey. And it didn't start off terribly well. I had called Colin and said, look, we're completely new to this. What do we have to bring? And I said, you don't have to bring anything. Everything will be provided. So we showed up with nothing. And then, of course, the first workshop was now you grab your masks and your swords, and say, hey, we have no masks, we have no swords, we have nothing. But everybody was incredibly helpful and said, oh, grabbed us. You guys, for what you're doing, you don't need your masks here. You can lend out your masks to these guys.
Yeah, that was pre-COVID, so we all shared gear without.
Yeah. and so Colin was offering the absolutely latest in technology. He had these nylon swords. So
very sophisticated for that time. That was what, you were 2012 or something? When was this?
This was 2010, I think.
Oh, okay, that's really early days, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, we were. Yeah, 9 or 10. It was 2009, 2010. I have to look it up again. So I mean, Sam was only sort of 11 or something like that, but he participated in the workshops, and he got a lot of respect because he took it very seriously. And yeah, I mean, we all had a blast. So anyway, at that point, it was still sort of a two-part event, with the first 2.5 days being workshops and then tournaments. We didn't stay for the tournaments, but 2 years later we went back for the tournaments, and Jack participated in the tournaments.
Yeah, Jack got a very early start as a tournament competitor. I remember. I remember he was already. I think they had the old internet. I'm not even in the modern internet ranking except for a handful of fights, but they had the original internet ranking for longsword fencers, and I was already chatting with you guys, and I was astonished to see that Jack, I think, was like, we were like within one rank of each other on the list, and I was like, man.
Yeah, I was quite disappointed by that ranking. When they went from the very initial ranking, sort of, I was in the top 1,000 fencers in the world.
Yeah.
And they said they were going to expand it, and I said, I'm totally against that, because I'm going to fall out of the top 10.
I know. 1,000. Yeah, I was like 22 at one point, and then now I'm not. Now I'm like 100.
But anyway, yeah, that is progress. So
they didn't count all the old fights, though. That was the.
No, of course. Yeah. If they had counted that, yes, there's no way I would. That's quite right.
So look, before we go on, I want to mention the fact that you're being very humble, but you have one advanced law degree or multiple? You're a PhD, right?
Yes, I have I did my master's in Zurich, and then I did research on my PhD in Tokyo. I got my PhD again from Zurich, but it was about a subject of Japanese law. So
you're an expert in. I think we've discussed this a bit. Swiss law, Japanese law, and English maritime law. Is that right?
Not specifically maritime. Initially, when I took my law degree, it was completely unimaginable that a law degree would be able to carry over from one jurisdiction into even a neighboring jurisdiction. It was a major accomplishment of the Swiss federal system that a lawyer from one canton was admitted in another canton. But just the notion that carrying law degrees from one jurisdiction to the next was unheard of. But then Maggie Thatcher came up, and she said, law is just a closed shop union, and I'm union busting. So she busted that one.
Union busting. Yeah. Well, that's one case where there's some merit to the idea, to her thinking.
Yeah, and so that then brought up the possibility of transporting academic degrees from one jurisdiction to the next. Now, I at that time I didn't have a bar exam. In Switzerland, we have a bifurcation of legal education. So the studying law at university, it's an academic degree, but that doesn't automatically entitle you to represent people in court. And actually, of all Swiss law degrees, maybe 10% at most go on to take a bar exam.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I came to, I took a bar exam fairly late in or mid-career, I should say, and I was very lucky in the sense that I applied in a rural canton where everybody knows everybody, and they said, well, basically, we'll allow you to try. We're not going to make it any easier for you, but they what they did do is they recognized the experience I'd had as sufficiently legal experience to represent the 2 years of experience you need.
The kind of apprenticeship period.
Yes, exactly. But normally you have sort of you'd have to have done time at a court and time with a lawyer in private practice. But they just looked at my general experience and said, if he wants to try.
Well, they're fairly sensible there. So, and I think, how did we meet? Was it through Scala Forum or something? Or because I remember we were sort of exchanging emails, and you sent me this history that you had done a history of Switzerland for the boys.
Yes, it started. I think it must have been through Jack or something. I mean, there was the Codex Balticum was. Right. Was one of the things where we connected, and I wrote back to you, be kind to your reader or something like that.
Yeah, you helped me a lot. Well, that's why I was kind of pivoting to it too. So because of all your expertise, I'm sorry, go ahead, please continue.
And then the other thing was that you had this connection with Pier Marco. And he had a copy of the Bolognese
oh yeah
armed societies
you translated that from Latin
articles, and you were looking for somebody, you were hoping that it might say something about fencing, and it turned out to be something completely divorced from fighting, but
it was about those little kind of armed militias, right?
Armed societies, the Societatis Armatae of Bologna from the mid 13th century, and you had written an article in the first Acta Periodica, and I had picked up a copy of the Acta Periodica in Dijon. And Olivier had
that's Olivier
presented
found the
Olivier
famous
Dupuy.
New Meyer manual.
Yeah, he had presented his findings in a sort of event there at Dijon, and I thought it was fascinating because I had great trouble coordinating my movements to do any of these choreos, or not choreos, but
the devices,
forms, devices, and so when I saw what Olivier was doing, I said, well, this is something I can do. So I gravitated toward that, and then I don't know whether you remember the first version of Acta Periodica, but it was not yet up to quite academic standards.
It was a little rough around the edges.
A little ropey, and it didn't help that there was a typo in the title.
Yeah, well, it was very punk rock in that sense. So we met early on. We collaborated on that thing. You generously started translating a bunch of Latin, which I'm always trying to find people to help me translate stuff because I'm that typical cliche of an American that I really don't have. At least I certainly don't have medieval Latin or early New High German down. So I try to make deals with friends and do swap favors and things like that. Which I have to say, growing up in New Orleans in the old punk days and the sort of street life did ironically help me dealing with academics, because it's something I don't know if I should even go there, but there's certain similarities. Let's just put it that way. Academics often have something which they want to share with the world or share with somebody, but they're scared it's going to be stolen, and you have to earn their trust, And so you really helped me, and we would have arguments and discussion online. We are kind of comparing notes and trying to figure out. And you have being Swiss, you have a much more insight into these free cities and so on, because the it's so close to the surface there. And you helped me with a concept that really kind of was a Rosetta Stone in a way. It's not the only one, but it was one of a handful that really helped me click or grok on understanding medieval society, which was the concept of the medieval estate. You were explaining that how that's different in law, and you had a nice succinct way to explain that, and it really clicked for me. And how an estate is different from class, and how it sort of highlights the unique nature of society then that it's so different from now. So I want to try to summarize what I got out of your explanation, and then I'd like you to flesh it out and correct my errors, if that's amenable.
Sure.
So what I came away understanding is that whereas today we have this sort of package of rights and responsibilities that comes with being a part of a state. So you're born in Switzerland, or you're born in the U.S., or you're born in, I mean, Switzerland's not a good example because it's so unique, but let's say you're born in France or the U.S. or whatever, you gain certain rights. You're allowed to live in, you're born in the U.S., you're a citizen, you're allowed to live in the U.S., you're allowed to work there. You have constitutional rights, and you have certain responsibilities. Like you may be drafted for the military. You have to pay taxes and so on. And it's the same for everyone, at least in theory. I could say things about oligarchs and but let's just say in theory it's the same. Whereas in the Middle Ages, each right and each responsibility was unique, really. So every person might have an obligation to pay part of a certain tax, but you're free from another tax, and you may have a right to sell one thing in one place, but not in other places, and you may have a obligation to serve a certain person certain times under certain circumstances. It might be like could be a young nobleman or a ministerial or somebody who's obligated to, for 10 days a year, help a baron if they're in big trouble under certain, so there's all these individualized rules. So that's one of the meanings of a state. And another meaning of the estate is your personal status, your wealth, your possessions. This is the two ways that we use the term estate in English today are, the estate of someone when they're deceased or during, and then there's real estate, which is it's the real estate. It's the land that you own. That's I guess the realest thing, as opposed to maybe your debts or people owe you and so on. And then so that's one. And then there's packages of estates that are kind of similar for different groups of people. So the French proposed this idea of the three estates: those who work, those who fight, those who pray. And we could see in other countries, in other regions of Europe, there's other estates. The burghers in some places have their, and in some places like university students and scholars are kind of their own estate. So so that really, we know that there's sort of lower nobility have a certain typical range of rights and responsibilities. And there's other nobles so a lot of nobles that are in Central Europe, there were ministerials, meaning they were technically serfs, which is a really odd thing to think about from a modern perspective, or based on our cliches of the time. And they're obligated to some other nobleman, or sometimes to a city, or it could be to a bishopric or something. And so they're vassals of that entity or person. Whereas there's another knight who might be a little poorer, or might not have as much land or as many castles, but they are a free imperial knight. And therefore they don't owe anybody anything. So anyway, that's my sloppy, open-ended, messy, not succinct explanation for this thing that you explained very elegantly in 2 sentences. But it's really opened it up. And so that the final comment is that when you're reading primary sources from the period, or when you're reading good secondary sources like something like Hans Delbrück or something, they'll refer to the estates of such a place, the estates of Silesia, the estates of Turgau or something like that. And that what that means usually, it's yet another meeting for the word. That means usually the assemblies or the diets that where all the people that have any power, all the entities that could be groups of people, communities, families, or individual nobles of princely rank or prelates, meaning princes of the church. All the people that have stake and power in a particular region, they get together and they have these little meetings. They have these little assemblies, and what they think may or may not matter. In some cases, it doesn't matter at all because the prince is powerful enough to just not care what they think. In some places, they run the whole show, and that's something we'll talk about. That was one of the things I wanted to steer to too, which is the Swiss model. And in a lot of places, somewhere in between, right? The prince has a lot of authority and influence, but the estates, if there's something they really don't like, and they're all, or some of them are mad enough about it, that may change policy. So those are multiple definitions of estates.
Yeah.
So tell me where I went off the rails here.
No, that's fine. I'll throw in another one. In the Church of England marriage ceremony, there is a phrase that said, marriage is an honourable estate. By marrying, you are changing your legal status. You are no longer a bachelor or a spinster in the sort of Church of England terminology.
Right.
But you are now part of a married couple, and that changes several things. I mean, obviously, the status of your children is very different.
Oh yeah.
Whether you are married or you are not.
Born in wedlock or not born in wedlock.
So,
which is a huge thing back in those days that we don't think about anymore today.
Yeah. In my own family, there was a very,
when we were kids, when I was a kid, there was still opprobrium to, being born out of wedlock or something like that.
Yeah.
And also to divorce. I mean, I was from the generation that grew up in the 70s where everybody got divorced, but all the people that were 10 years older than us, nobody got divorced, and so they would, there was sort of a thing they would, oh, he's from a broken family, or whatever.
Yeah.
So that puts you into another estate. Well, this makes me want to dovetail or to pivot to yet another thing. If you're finished with your explanation.
No, as you say, and the what we find today so difficult to grasp about the Middle Ages is precisely this the interlocking nature of, as we would see it, an individual's different identities. So on one hand, maybe the identity as a member of a guild and a rank within that guild. And then maybe because of the membership in the guild, also membership in one of the councils of the local polity. And as you said, it depends on whether this is a princely polity or a self-governing imperial free city. Or a rural corporation where there is a Landsgemeinde. It even though your status may be technically the same, which of depend in each of these three different scenarios has a very different practical implication, and so all of these different entities were largely self-governing, and it was very, very difficult for princes to pass a law and implement it throughout the society, just because they didn't have the access. They couldn't enforce it throughout the society because you had all these bulwarks against central power, against any power, and
because everybody's protecting their estate. They're protecting.
Yeah, everybody's exactly, because your estate is is partly your identity, but it is also your economic and personal safety and security. Because you are a member of an estate, that means that you are part of the feudal order, and the feudal order generates some protections. If you're outside of that feudal order, like many of the itinerant folk were, then you have no protection. If you get killed,
and in a way, well, yeah, okay. So here's another. You're making me keep wanting to pivot in different directions, but so here's another direction on that in terms of looking at estates. Is that we have
yeah,
these sort of default packages that people have in different areas.
yeah,
So the towns, and this is another thing I think that's funny about the pre-industrial world is how litigious and law oriented it is. And I
yeah,
think that will disappoint a lot of fans of certain genre fiction TV shows and things. Like I love telling people how litigious the Vikings were. They're constantly in lawsuits. Like really,
yeah,
that's Vikings lawsuit. A lawsuit can feature a sword fight. That's possibly part of it, but
yeah.
they are in lawsuits. So one of the things I find fascinating, so here in New Orleans where I grew up, we have the Vieux Carré, the French Quarter, which has become basically a sink of over tourism, which I won't even get into that. But right in the middle of downtown French Quarter, we have there's the cathedral, and next flanked by the two 18th century Spanish government buildings. There's one for the church, the presbytere, and one for the government, the cabildo. And the alley between the cabildo and the church is called Pirates Alley because that's where the pirates used to hang out when they were in, they knew they were wanted by the municipal authorities or the governor. And when the thief takers came for them, they run in the church, and then they're under a different legal system. They can say. So I want to talk about that for a second. The idea that part of what estates means is that there's all these unique, different legal systems, and you might slightly disagree with my interpretation of this, but the way I see it is you've got the feudal system, which is sort of like outlined in the Sachsenspiegel. They've got the Landrecht and the Landrecht, the
Yeah.
land right, the land law, and the feudal laws, and all the feudal obligations people have. And there's that whole thing with the princely courts, the princes being the fürsten, the boss of each different district. And in the U.S., we have counties in most of the U.S. and Louisiana we have parishes, but it's the same thing basically. But if you figure a county, if you're in a county in the U.S., what that word means is that's the equivalent land of a count. So the count would be the boss. It'd be a guy who was the boss of that county. That's about how much territory a count has. So you've got that feudal system, and if you've got issues, there's something going on in the county, you got a dispute over grazing rights or something, or you think somebody stole something, you go to the court of that count. You would go to his castle or palace, and that's the way the law works, and it'll all be based on this feudal law that's been recorded going back a couple of centuries by the time we're in the era of the fencing masters. And then there's the town. The town has the charter, which is every concession they've ever managed to extract from a regional prince or prelate, and they write it down permanently. As soon as anybody says, hey, yeah, you can sell sheep over here. Yeah, you can sell your sheep over there on that island. They're like, click, click, get the scribe, write it down. It's going into the charter. And we're never, ever, ever going to let anybody take that right away from us ever again. We're always going to have a right to graze sheep on that one spot that you just said we could do it. And the feudal law does not necessarily recognize the town law, but the town law uses it as an excuse to fight back when they're being picked on. And then there's the church law, which is a totally unique legal system. So, for example, the church had an industry of penance where they would send people on pilgrimage. So if you did something wrong, I punched Jürg Gassman in the mouth for no reason. Okay, that was pretty bad. Why did you do that? He's a nice guy. So you're going to need to go walk to, Jerusalem or Santiago de Compostela or something, and prove that you went there and back. And of course, the church makes money on that. Whereas if the town authorities caught me doing that, I might get flogged or exiled, or it would depend on my estate. It would depend on my status. And then there's enclaves of the church within the town. Could be convent or an abbey or the cathedral or whatever, and they operate under church law. They don't have to follow town law. They have a different legal system. So the town is frustrated with that. The town itself exists in the territory or near the territory of a prince, and the town ignores the prince's wishes a lot of the time and ignores their legal system. And then also in inside the town, you'll also have universities, and the students have their own set of laws that they follow. They have their own legal system. They have their own judges in court. Isn't that what a rector used to be in a church, in the university? I know there's a specific rank that was like in charge of.
Yeah, I mean, the rector is the head of the university, and the formal term of address for a university's rector is magnificence.
Magnificence. Okay.
Magnificence. Your magnificence.
Yes, I get it. Yes, your magnificence. So, yeah. So the students had their own legal system. If a student gets in a fight and kills somebody or something, he's not judged by the town authorities, and he's not judged by the prince that lives nearby, the duke or whoever.
Yeah, that's the dispute between town and gown.
Well, that's where it gets hairy, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a major issue. So the idea that there's all these legal systems that are different and unique, and they all kind of ignored each other. They would get in trouble because they weren't really considering, the princes especially would just ignore everybody else's idea of what their rights were. So that was a lot of times the source of trouble. And then the lower ranking nobility and the ministerials, their legal system, if somebody ripped them off, somebody owed them money, somebody did them a wrong, to redress those rights, they first go to see the duke. But if that person, whoever harmed them, is sort of like friends with the duke and they can't get a fair trial, which is not guaranteed, then they start robbing people and kidnapping people as a way to continue their lawsuit, basically. And that gets them in trouble with the town there, right? So, and we know that, speaking of college towns, the college towns in medieval Europe, I've done some research on this, and as have you, I think, on things like homicide rates and how that's changed over time, or how violent was a medieval town. Well, the most violent medieval towns, the ones that come closest to the level of violence we have today in some of our big cities in the US, for example, were the university towns like Bologna and Oxford and Cambridge and Paris, Pavia. I think Pavia was a little less crazy because the Venetians were running it. But that's another interesting thing, because you got all these basically affluent kids who mostly come from wealthy families and aristocratic families with, where their honor is a palpable thing. And they from all different parts of the world, and they form these groups they called natio. Is that the right way to pronounce it?
Yeah, a Nazi nation. That's the same root as our modern day word nation. Yeah.
Yeah. So all the people, but they're not very logical. So it'll be a different basis on each town. But in one university,
the knightly societies like the Templars and sort of the Hospitallers, they also had these nations that within the organization there was sort of the French nation, there was the Italian nation, but then the Italian nation was it might not have included all the Italian cities.
It might have all the Scots in it or something weird.
Yeah, exactly. But not the Florentines, because they were then with somebody.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Like I know that a bunch of the universities near France, they have like there's one natio for the Germans and the Dutch, and then there's one for the Czechs and the Poles and the Bavarians or something, and all of them are in one together. And then there's like 6 different French ones. There's like a Breton one, a Gascon one, a Picard one. Like,
yes.
Y'all can't be together, huh? Yeah. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of our time, so I want to pivot to this idea of the and we'll have more discussions, because we're kind of setting up the groundwork here.
Okay.
But the Landsgemeinde.
Yeah.
So
I mean, one of the possible estates within the feudal structure was that you had rural corporations. You had the cities, which was sort of an incorporated town. We find that a fairly straightforward concept to accept. But you had the same thing as, let's say, all the inhabitants of a valley were incorporated as an estate. And then the Landsgemeinde was sort of the assembly, or the mechanism within the estate, within this corporation, on how this corporation was self-governing. And so on one hand you had the executive, so the elected members of government, and there were certain offices. There's the Landamann, there's the Landesfähnrich, who is basically the minister for defense. You have the warden of the seals, who is the minister for justice, and things like that. So these are elected by the Landsgemeinde, by all the voting population, which at that time was men who bore arms and were permitted to bear arms. Coming together
and having citizen status in between 16
and
16, basically.
Yeah, and they would vote. I mean, it sounds very democratic, but we have to bear in mind this was it was one man, one vote, but it was not a secret vote, so everybody could see how people were voting.
I want to plunge into that, but let's back up just for a second for people who don't know what it is. So what we're talking about is something that's been referred to as an assembly, or a diet is another way, although it's not this. A diet usually means different elements, but you do have different elements even with the valley. And I also want to point out that, okay, so we have this ruling assembly where people go outside, and it was part of the rule is that you would bring a weapon, and that was the rule up until the 1990s, I think, in certain places.
No, it's still a rule. It's still the rule.
It's still a rule. Okay, so the other point I want to make is that you lived in one of these places, Appenzell Innerrhoden, right?
I lived in Ausserrhoden, and Ausserrhoden, when I was in school, Ausserrhoden still had a Landsgemeinde. It was then abolished in 89-90. But Innerrhoden, the neighboring canton, the other half of the canton of Appenzell, still has a Landsgemeinde.
Okay, so this is where people go out in a big field on a sunny day, and in the Germanic versions of this, it's always outside, right? Is that?
Yeah.
And so they typically do it, I guess, in the good weather in the spring or something, right?
The fourth Sunday in April.
There you go, spring. So, and everybody stands outside. Everybody brings a weapon, and they vote. So I would say, and this is how the community made certain decisions. Not all decisions. It's not like they didn't have rulers. It's that this was the way certain decisions were. Either the decision itself was made, and I remember reading, it was pretty funny, an article about Appenzell Innerrhoden, that one of the more recent decisions was to outlaw nude hiking, which I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah. I had my views on that, but you know, you have to understand that it's easily understandable. It's not it wasn't an unreasonable reaction to what happened.
No, I get it. I heard about.
I mean, but you know, my view was that they should have the police inspect somebody who wants to do nude hiking and certify them whether them hiking nude would constitute an offense against morality and good taste.
If it looks like me, they should not get a pass to go nude hiking. But if it looks
it's same with me. But I mean, there's other people where you might say, oh well, you know.
Yeah, right. I don't mind. I didn't hate that.
But you know, you have these. And you know, I you know, this is in the Alpstein, which is very, very well traveled. And you just had too many new tourists stumbling into church gatherings.
Exactly. I read about the issue. I don't want to get caught in this segue on that.
No, okay, sorry, but it's just
okay. So Landsgemeinde, this is the Swiss version of the rural assembly, because there are urban assemblies. And one of the things I want to get across to our audience who might be interested in historical fencing, or they might be interested in medieval history, is there were these assemblies, these little voting groups, usually in the open, especially in the Germanic areas, which would include this area, and all the way up into the Scandinavia. It was a thing that it was supposed to be in the open, and a lot of times it's under. They had a belief in those days, which for all I know is true, that they thought that linden trees or limewood trees were immune to lightning. So they have in hundreds of villages and towns all over Central Europe. They still have, and there's one at the old, I forget what it's called, the Lindenhof in Zurich. I
mean, those are 19th century, but still, I mean.
Well, some of the trees themselves have been there in these places. There's a good German.
Yeah, in other places, but in Lindenhof, a lot of history was recreated in the 19th century.
Okay. Well, I have Brown and Hogenberg map from 15
Yeah,
whatever, and there is a
yeah,
big tree on there, although it's not
yeah,
detailed enough for me to tell if it's a linden tree. But anyway, a lot of times they would be the linden tree, and they
yeah.
do these assemblies, and it's really a lot like the Norse Ting or something like that, in that everybody's
Yeah,
out there,
yeah.
and it's not just to vote on certain policies. Usually, there's going to be a couple of votes, but they're also there to pay taxes. There's going to be legal judgments that happen, right? Does that happen in the Swiss?
Yeah,
version?
it depends very much on the constitution, but basically it is elections and it is laws.
And then
And
sometimes
laws
they
would
have
include
marriages too,
taxation, because I mean that is
right?
still
Right.
today. You know, we vote on our taxes in Switzerland. We set our level of taxation by vote in the canton and in the community.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why actually the Swiss taxes are, compared to all the, considering all the safety net and all the infrastructure and everything you get, your taxes are actually fairly low. Last time I looked into it,
Yeah.
compared to say France or something. But anyway, so yeah, so we have these assemblies, the people getting together
Yeah.
and voting, and there are different types of assemblies for the rural zones and for the urban zones. So I've looked into this in many different areas, and there's versions of this in the East Slavic zone. The Russians call it the Vesh, something like that, and there's versions of it that I'm not going to try to pronounce right now because I didn't prepare. But there's versions in Poland and multiple different versions, by the way, that evolve, and for different estates. So there's some that are more or less associated with, I would call, tribal people, but who in feudal law are recognized as peasants, even though a lot of times these people wouldn't consider themselves peasants necessarily. Sometimes they would, and they wouldn't argue with that. But so one of the other places that I've looked at this is in Frisia, which is way up north on the Baltic coast, where these people they're just tribes. They just never got they never really got feudalized, so they didn't consider themselves part of the feudal system at all, really, and they resisted. They were in a very low-lying area, and they kind of used the terrain to defend themselves. But it does seem similar. I've seen, and they have a version of this in Lithuania, and there's versions in other rural places all over Central Europe, where the rural ones seem similar. It's usually it's assembly outside. You do the court. Potentially you do taxes, and and a lot of times that's what they're voting on, and you do the elections, and there's kind of a party to it, right? It's also like it's a big festival. Everybody's getting together, and people are eating pretzels and things like that, and just you're going to eventually be drinking beer. And the ones at the towns,
once it's concluded, yes.
Yeah, once it's over. So the ones in the cities, they're all kind of unique. They are a little bit. There's a pattern, but it's different in every place. And then the church has their own elections, and even military, mercenary companies and stuff. So it's widespread. I just want to get that across. That this is something that happened.
Medieval society was instinctively collective. So monarchical decision making was more the deviation from the rule. As a rule,
instinctively collective, and also simultaneously into the idea of autonomy and self-management, self-rule.
Yeah, self-governing. Yeah.
Even places.
And I would say this is the nature of the feudal order. This is not distinct from the feudal order. It's the nature of the feudal order that you have this amalgam of these different power nodes that somehow come together.
This is an area where we a little bit disagree. But let me continue modeling out, and I don't. I see your point on it, but I have another angle too. But the model I just want to throw up there. So we've got the urban sort of their version of democracy, or the version of these assemblies, and then we've got the church and other states. I'll just say that because that's a complicated subject, but there is some self-management, like the Bolognese model for universities is self-managed too. It's very widespread. And then there is a thing, which is really what the Diet is more, where you've got multiple entities. Some of them maybe few are like outside Did I lose you? Somebody else.
No, I'm here.
So anyway, there's different entities, some of which maybe don't normally get along or understand each other, but who will get together to kind of keep the peace in the district. And so I've noticed the Swiss sort of have unique terms for all these things versus what the Germans say, but the Germans call that a Landsfrieden, and there's this word frei, that means freedom, and it means it means your rights, and it means so it means sort of like right to do different things, like right to trade and stuff, and it means just
your Pax and Teuger. One is relates to times, the other one relates to places. So places that are where you're not allowed to use violence, and then there's certain
exactly.
times.
So that's what the Landsfrieden was for. Usually, was to protect key infrastructure and things like that. They usually the example I give of the Landsfrieden and how it develops is a case where it just kept redeveloping and happening over and over again. Is because a lot of modern people would say, oh well, then why would there ever be any restrictions on warfare? Like civilian people that have never been in the military always say, what is that's Geneva Convention is so stupid. Why not use every weapon you have to kill the enemy? Well, because you don't want to make the battlefield too hellish. And the idea that even though people are dying, but the idea that there's rules in war is kind of alien to our modern way of looking at things. Or we believe
so it's all fair in love and war and something. Yeah.
Exactly, and we believe in this idea of like total war by default. You just annihilate the enemy. But in the Middle Ages, they didn't think that way. There were all kinds of rules in war.
Yeah.
And another thing I wanted to mention to you, I don't know if we ever discussed it, but if you read Christine de Pizan's book she wrote a book on warfare, and it's a case study on how to besiege a castle. And like a third of the budget goes to the attorneys. Like she's like, you got to get 1 million arrows, and you've got to get this many, trebuchet, and this many cannon, and this many crossbow bolts, and this many guns, and you got to hire all these lawyers. There's going to be a bunch of lawsuits and everything, which I thought was hilarious. But so the Landfrieden is usually designed in cases where you're trying to protect a region, and so the example I give is during what was called the Hunger Wars. The Poles and the Teutonic Knights started fighting each other, and in between their territories, they were doing scorched earth. They were just burning everything, and make a long story short, they created a famine, and the famine caused an outbreak of plague, they were closely related. And then the region was under like a plague for 10 years, and half the Teutonic Order died, and all these other people died. So then they got together after that, and even though Poles and the Teutonic Knights did not like each other, they hashed out a deal where they said, okay, next time we go to war, we're not going to burn any fields, we're not burning the mills, we're not pulling down the bridges, there was all kind of rules on certain things they weren't going to do. And a lot of times what these rules were for was to keep the lower ranking knights from doing all their kidnappings and robbery as part of their lawsuits, as they saw it. So to other people, they would call these people Raubritter, robber knight. But to the knight, I got a lawsuit. The Duke ripped me off, and I'm going to rob anybody that goes to do trade in the Duke's territory. And they see that as their only outlet, their only way of defending themselves. The town would tolerate that, but they're going to say, you cannot do that on the Imperial Road, and you cannot, you can't do it to women. You can't do it to certain kinds of merchants. You can't do it to, friars or whatever. And so the Landsfrieden would reinforce that as an alliance, a temporary alliance between entities that may not really trust or like each other. And that essentially is kind of what Switzerland is, right?
Yes, that's it. Where most of the Swiss estates were heavily dependent on trade.
It's a major north-south trade route, right?
Yeah, that's the whole point about the central Swiss. It's the northern ramp of the Gotthard, and then that's why they invaded Ticino and conquered the southern ramp of the Gotthard, and reached out toward Milan, trying to secure the approaches to Milan.
Let me interject for a second. He's talking about the Gotthard Pass, which is the major pass through the Alps that gets you from, Northern Europe to Italy, which is where, everybody wants all the stuff from Italy. So I'm sorry, keep going.
Yeah, and I mean, Zurich was trying to play both ends. On one hand, having alliances with the Central Swiss to secure access to the Gotthard, but also then building stepping stones toward the Grisons, toward the Roman era cross Transalpine passes, which the Julia Septima Maloja passes. This is how you got from Milan to into southern Germany before the Gotthard was opened in the early 13th century, and from altercations about that developed the Old Zurich War in the 1440s, which
right fascinating
medieval total war.
Yeah, fascinating and also quite aberrant moment in Swiss history, where the Old Zurich Wars, where Zurich, by getting entangled with getting confused about their various agendas and so on, decided to side against the rest of the Confederation, and they were kind of allying themselves with the hated Habsburgs, right?
Yep. Exactly.
And there's one Burgermeister, which is, we could very loosely say it's kind of like a mayor, who had pushed them in that direction. And then there's a wonderful painting of this where he one of the battles where they're losing.
St. Jakob an der Siel, where he got killed defending the
right. But there's a painting, a watercolor of him up on top of the bridge in his armor with a poleaxe, like fighting off the whole rest of the Swiss army, while all his citizens flee inside of the walls of Zurich. So he's buying up time with his life, which is a great, I mean, I always bring that up, like, well, how come our mayors don't do things like this? This is called taking responsibility. But so those are two things we could talk about maybe next time. I'm interested in the Grisons, because that's a case where it's like the Grisons is a very, tell me how to pronounce that properly.
Grisons, Graubünden, in German, Graubünden. You'd say Grisons okay.
So the Grisons, this is a very poor area, and correct me when I'm wrong, I'm doing my summary. It's a very poor area where the people are known for, one of the groups there is called the Grey League, because they've got.
I wouldn't say it's a poor area. I mean, the Grisons was in itself a very interesting. It was a three-part alliance between, as you say, the Graue Bund, the Grey Federation, and the third part was the Prince Bishop of Chur, as the oldest bishopric north of the Alps. So it was. So there's three. So the Prince Bishop of Chur, the Zehn Gerichte Bund, so the federation of the 10 courts, and the Grey Confederation. And what made it interesting is that with the Reformation, some went one way, some went the other way, but they sort of stayed together.
That's what kind of ended their role. But what makes it interesting to me, because it's even more complicated than what you're saying. There's a whole bunch of different leagues. It's
within these leagues, there's different leagues, and right. It is incredibly complicated. But I wouldn't say they were necessarily poor.
Okay, you correct me. So, but they're rural. They're rural, and they don't.
Oh yes, absolutely.
What makes it's these tiny little towns and the rural communes. That's a whole other angle. I'll come back around to that. But that are they you can kind of see in miniature, because it happened rather late. It happened like late 15th into the 16th century, where they created this alliance. It was almost like a miniature version of the story of the Swiss Confederacy itself. And they formed this little alliance. They were very brave. They got some assistance from the Swiss Confederation, but they made their own thing that eventually joined with the Swiss Confederation. But they kind of, the battles are fascinating.
A Zugewandter, an associate member of the Confederation. They were they weren't a full member until 1815.
Wow.
And what sort of then created a huge geopolitical interest in the Grisons was the fact that there was one valley, the Valtellina, that was the only connection between it was sort of the missing link between Austria and the Austrian in the 30 Years' War. Sorry, I should say in the 30 Years' War, the link between Austria and the Austrian armies fighting in Germany and the source of their wealth, which was the South American gold. So that had to come across the Atlantic into northern Italy, through Milan, and then through this one valley that was sitting in between the Grisons and Venice. And that was the only land connection between Austria and its gold. And so
and in the earlier period, in the 15th century and earlier, that was part of this really important trade route between North and South Europe, and also specifically between Venice, which was kind of an ally of a bunch of these Central European towns, like very closely linked to Nuremberg, for example. And so all the Silk Road stuff that's come into Venice, then they're trading through that pass in exchange for silver and all kinds of goods that are coming from Central Europe. And that's the whole incident where Hans Talhofer got into maybe it seems to have murdered a robber knight, was because of a convoy coming through that pass from Venice that was confiscated by these barons, and it got him into a conflict with Nuremberg. But yeah, that's a whole fascinating thing angle to go off into. But okay, just to wrap it up, I want to kind of touch on, and we won't have to get super deep into this, but you mentioned early on, we were just talking about it. It's like this form of democracy, particularly this rural form, it's Landsgemeinde, where you're out in the field, standing there with your sword, and you're voting in public. That is a major difference from what we consider how universal suffrage is supposed to work today, where you vote in secret. You go into a booth, you close the curtain, and nobody knows who you voted for, because this is a different system. This is where you're, first off, there are leaders, there's bosses, there's factions, there's rich and poor, and there's much more powerful people among all the others. It's not like everybody's equal. And so you got groups of people who like Jürg, and you got groups of people who like Jean, and groups of people who like Matt Easton, or let's say, whatever. And when you vote, everybody's going to immediately know what side you picked. And because you're doing it in public, you're subject to pressure. And that's both good and bad, because if somebody's doing something against the community's interests in general, or a large part of the community, that's going to be immediately obvious. Like, well, those people don't like it. All the bakers and butchers voted against it. I guess we better figure out what they don't like about it, or what I mean. So it is a form of self-management. It's a different approach, and it definitely is subject to certain kinds of problems. Like, you can have a demagogue. This is basically kind of like the way the Athenian system worked, where everybody's voting in public and on the same, on a particular.
Clearly, this is not our modern concept of democracy, and it wasn't, a model of democracy. You can't say that these were, democracies. But I have to say that, having seen it in action and having lived in it, there is a certain also Zivilcourage, a certain civil courage, where you stand by your opinion. You don't hide behind, I'm for this, but then when I'm in secret, I make my cross somewhere else. No, you stand by what you say. You go into it with a position, and you can change your mind. It is not just that everybody's called in and said, you vote on this. There is discussion, and
sometimes they'll do multiple votes, right? There might be
there might be several rounds, and this is. You are right that it's susceptible to demagoguery, but it is also a recipe against demagoguery. That a demagogue usually is only powerful because of certain machinations that they can organize in the background. But if everybody out in the open stands up, the demagogue is gone. It is really that easy.
Unless they're really good at oratory. But so
it can be, if they convince people.
A different kind of demagogue. It's not like the kind we have today. But so I personally, I do consider this democracy. I just think it's a different type, and I think there's pros and cons to all these different approaches. And I also think it's the fact that it's a relatively small community that's deciding its own fate. and it still works. It's still deciding laws in Switzerland in a way that does seem to.
Yeah, and you see, most of the issues that you're deciding are not abstract issues. They're very concrete issues. They say, look at our schoolhouse.
Right.
It's really crappy. Do we want to increase our taxes by 5% and get it done properly, or are we going to let our children to continue to go into this insanitary building? So it is very practical, and there is nothing left or right about a pothole.
Right. No, yeah, I totally agree. It's grassroots, and it's one of several different approaches. But I would say also that the fact, whether it's this sort of simple country system, the Landsgemeinde, or one of the urban systems that are a little more complex, in either case, on really major issues, like, for example, whether or not we're going to go to war, everybody's got to sign off on it. Everybody gets a chance to vote whether they want to or not. And that's something we don't even not even Congress votes on wars for the U.S. anymore. That's the president just sends troops. They don't even declare war anymore. I think that's a good example of a case, or and all the major taxes too. But a lot of decisions that affect your life, you do get a say in those. Treaties, they can't sign treaties unless everybody agrees. I
mean, just take the example you mentioned earlier with Rudolf Stüssy and the old Zurich War. I mean, he was to some extent a demagogue. He was carrying the Zurich faction to continue in the war, and when he was killed, some other machinations, but Habsburg, Zurich's nominal ally, took tighter control over the conduct of the war. And when the Zuricher saw that, they said, hang on, we don't want to become an instrument of Habsburg. And so they kicked out the Habsburgs and made a disadvantageous, but they made a peace with the other Swiss. Yeah. And that kept the Habsburgs out, because the other Swiss were saying the normal Swiss compromise is we return to the status quo ante. And even though it was an absolutely brutal war, I mean, it was literally medieval total war, they went back to the status quo ante.
Ships and stuff too. That's one of the things I love about that war, is that there's all these really cool war barges and war boats and war rafts.
Yeah, and there was the whole garrison of Greifensee was executed, which was considered a war crime at the time. And one of the comments was, how could that happen? Did you not have any knights on your side who could have arranged that in accordance with the laws of war?
Yeah, I mean, you're not supposed to massacre.
No, you're not supposed to do that. I mean,
that's one of the things. And although the Swiss were kind of known for not being too good with captives, there
is that. But you have to say, in Burgundy, I mean, Charles shouldn't have just drowned the garrison of.
No argument for my point of view. I've come around to really having a lot of respect for Philippe Le Bon, and out of respect for Fabrice Cognac, I have my Burgundian patriot hat that I put on, even though I really team Switzerland, because it is a magnificent thing they created, but which Charles then squandered.
Yeah,
but we'll talk about that another time. That the whole thing, the incredible, wonderful comeuppance of being cruel and ruthless to prisoners, and then getting your ass handed to you in return. But circling back to the whole democratic thing, one of the things I've noticed with the towns, and the towns are kind of a subject for another time too, but in general, that there were towns that leaned a little more populist, where the crowd had a little more. There were towns where the wealthier patriciate had a lot more power. And those towns actually tended to be less volatile and less aggressive in some ways. The populous towns that were more democratic, they seemed to sort of govern better. Excuse me, over the short term, but periodically they would have this problem where they'd get a demagogue. And like the other example, there's a funny case at Rothenburg ob der Tauber, and I forget the name of the Burgermeister there. And that Rothenburg is like this little town that was mostly beautiful little town, highly preserved. It's very medieval. It's really cool to go just even look at pictures. Very famous. But at one point they had they were usually under the thumb of the Margrave of Brandenburg or somebody, some really powerful prince. But they had a Burgermeister who was ambitious, and he started capturing some territory around the town, and he defeated several of the regional barons in different wars, and eventually he went a little too far, and there was this massive feud declared against him. And his foreign policy had been completely successful, and he was sort of defeating and pushing back all these noble families. But then something like 200 noble families declared feud on Rothenburg, and this guy who lived in a fortified house that you could flood the land around it and everything. It's like one of those castle houses. The town just turned on him. They were like, "Man, this is too much. You're winning, but you're playing games, and this is our life." And they killed him. I mean, he was just he had gone too he was too ambitious. So they got to walk a fine line. And in the Swiss Confederation, it's the two examples are Bern and Zurich. And Zurich we think of today as like fancy, super rich folks, but Zurich was the revolutionary town back then. That was the craft guild. It was the crafts that ran that town.
Yeah, the French ambassador to Switzerland, who was residing in the very civilized Solothurn at the time, he attended a dinner of the guilds of Zurich, and he said the only thing they were served was boiled beef and young wine. He said, "Your Majesty, I will lay down my life for you, but I shall never again attend a dinner of the guilds of Zurich."
Right? Yeah. That's because that's the funny thing. It's like you'd have these towns where it was kind of the plumbers and the bakers and stuff run the city, and then there's somewhere where it's like affluent. What they called merchants today. That term merchant usually means in the U.S. that means like somebody that runs a convenience store, but what these people are more like was what we would call like a broker, or even a banker in some cases.
Yeah, like Archer Daniels Midland or something like that.
Yeah, they had vast amounts of money, and they sometimes were part of these companies. That's another one I want to explore one day is the Grand Ravensburg company. That's such a fascinating story there. But all right, look, we should wrap this up. I know it's getting late where you're at, and I really enjoyed it. So let's do some more of these and dig more into Switzerland. But I want to thank you for helping me understand the concept of the estate, which just changed my perspective. Instead of this simplistic top-down thing that we have, it's a completely different approach. And I just suddenly, it's like my point of view shifted from this sort of high level from above thing to down in the weeds and from the side. So thank you for getting that across to me, and so many other things that you've clarified over the years and helped me understand. Because
for me it was very interesting. Baltic is not something that I knew much about, and so for me having to adapt my point of view to an area that was also outside the Holy Roman Empire, but still influenced by the same legal thinking and concept was very interesting. So I learned a lot there.
Another one we
can
discuss later about that. But yeah, that's the idea of the syncretism of medieval society and the way multiple cultures come together. This is a thing that the Germans had a knack. They had an industry for creating towns. They would literally be hired by princely nobles to come in and survey towns. And this also included towns that already existed. So they would come out and they would survey and say, look, this is where you want to put the water drainage, and this is where you want to put the market square, and this is where the town hall should be, and this is where your wall should be. And they would reorganize towns on that basis. So you've got all these towns that had these German charters in places that are today we don't think of as German. So most of the big towns in Poland and Sweden, and I mean I know you know all this, but for other folks listening. So there's and in Hungary and in what's now Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania, and under very different circumstances. Sometimes it was somebody bringing settlers in. Sometimes it was because of an alliance that happened, or all different reasons. So you've got this fusion of different cultures, and they've all have this certain elements in common, which is that German town law. That's a copy. It would literally copy and paste from other towns. Lubeck law was the law in Lubeck, being a city in northern Germany today. It was the law in hundreds of little towns all over East Central Europe and up around Scandinavia and stuff. So they would have that element, but then you have the completely local and the combination of all the different settler groups that are there and the local people that are intermixed with them. And so that's like something we have here we call Creole, where people from different backgrounds, it's like you borrow from, you learn how to cook the grilled oysters from the Croatians, and you learn how to use the lemongrass from the Vietnamese, and the okra from the Africans, and the sauce piquant from the French. And so we put things together that way. That's kind of how jazz music was created. And I do think this is a big feature of the medieval world, but that's another thing to talk about some other time. But this fusion of elements, and I find are particularly helpful for me to understand this world, because knowing Swiss law, you're from a place that really Swiss law is fairly, because it's still kind of medieval law, isn't it? Wouldn't you say?
Well, maybe not so much the law, but certainly the conception of the structure of the polity is late medieval.
Or I should say, maybe we should say the polities, plural, and the way that they're connected.
Yeah. So today, when we do one of our votes on changing the constitution, which we do several times a year, you have to have the majority of the cantons and the majority of the population, and the German term is das Ständemehr. So the majority of the estates has to approve.
Yeah.
And our Senate is called der Ständerat, so the Council of the Estates.
So, yeah. And it is very much like a diet, where it's a meeting of equals, more or less, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we are no longer a confederation; we are a federal state. But the notion of a balance between the interests of the estates of the different regions, where we have Catholic and Protestant, we have rural and city, we have different cultures, and so the notion that there has to be a balance between them is very, very strong. And even though it's not really in law, but you have to.
Yeah, so it's in the skeleton of
it's in the political culture, and it goes to the
structure, right? It's your joists and your sills and the timber of your house is this a medieval design, which is seems very ultra modern in a lot of ways. It's sort of post.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said the EU would be much more successful if it models itself more on the Holy Roman Empire than on a unitary state.
I've been saying that too, and I kind of think they are a little. I think they have loosened up a little bit.
No. I'm sorry. We're getting into an area where I'm.
Well, I do notice a lot more regionalism, let's say, and I noticed when they were talking about COVID that it seemed like they had. That the different regions were deciding what to do, and the central government was claiming they couldn't, force that on anybody. And I noticed that all these, all the old Hanseatic cities, once again, call themselves Free and Hanseatic City of XYZ, and they have these special new trade organizations where there is some political element to it, because there's cities in Belgium and Poland and Germany and Finland and Sweden and stuff that have this sort of connection now, where they have an agenda that's not always identical to the state they're in, right? I noticed we did a big road trip in 2019. We went from Dijon and then we went down. We went to Lausanne and through Gruyere, which is that's an interesting, weird place.
Yeah, that's yeah.
With the Giger Museum, it's such a beautiful bucolic place, and then you step into like
it's a bit wrenching, isn't it?
Insanity, my God! I thought I was. I know that's a whole other discussion. And then Bern, and then Basel, where we went to the Wasserfont where Meyer worked, and they still have a water mill there. And we went to Alsace and all the way down the Rhine. And we went to went to Mainz and Heidelberg and all these different towns. And I definitely felt like there was a lot more emphasis on the regional thing than I remember, and I thought they were more relaxed. I mean, the last time I spent any significant time in Germany really was when I was in the army over there in the 80s. So it had been quite a while. And it wasn't even Germany; it was West Germany where I was at the time, But it sure had a different feel this time. I mean, I guess maybe just the Rhineland is just a nice.
Oh, well, Rhineland is renowned to be more relaxed.
Is that the fact? That's interesting. I didn't know that. We had a fun time on the trip too. Driving down the Rhine, I was late to do my talk at Dijon. We're rushing down and we're going parallel, and we kept seeing all these cool castles that were kind of blown up. And I was Googling them on my phone, and every one of them was like destroyed by one of the Alsatian towns or by Strasbourg. And I was like, this one got burned by the Strasbourg militia in 1471. And Marty's like, yeah, just rolling her eyes. Just look at the map. Where's the next turn off? Anyway, look, great talking to you. Really appreciate it. And I'd love to do this again if you're amenable, and hopefully we'll have some other people.
Happy to.
All right, Jörg, thank you so much.
Okay.
Cheers.